Hey, good evening there, folks. Thanks for joining us. We're starting a fiveable stream here on periods 5 and 6 in APUSH. So hopefully you folks are excited for some more U.S. history. Thanks for joining us. Everybody able to hear me okay? Things going okay? Everybody doing okay in their lockdown or stuck at home or whatever they may be doing? Looks like we got some stuff going on in the chat already. If you can go ahead and throw down something in the chat, let me know how your week's been going. Let me know how your APUSH studying's been going. And of course, ask questions there. That's a great place to do it. If you have some big topic questions, then go ahead and throw those in the ask a question function down below. If you have some small ones or you just want to share the anguished cry that is Peter's emoji, then feel free to do that as well. Thanks for jumping in there, Peter. Yeah. So we're going to be covering periods 5 and 6, sometimes called units 5 and 6, depending on the terminology. Same thing, same history, so we should be good. This is a bit of a broader overview. It's only content. It's not talking about a whole bunch of the DBQ skills. We'll talk about that just briefly, but a couple of preliminaries just off the bat here, if I can get over to that screen. Remember, we got these free weekly streams going on in a bunch of different subjects, getting a little bit of the content going. If you want a bit more of the deep dive, obviously you got that cram pass. We have some of that coming up. Cram pass on unit 6. The deep dive is coming up next week, Tuesday, 9 p.m. Join us. It'll be a good time. And then we also start the 2-a-week cram passes next week. And so Thursday at 7, a little bit different, we're going to be doing a deep dive into dates and study tips. So how do you study well? How do you use dates? How do you use chronology, etc.? Then there's the final free review on Unit 7 next week at 9 p.m. And then we dive in deeper to Unit 7 for the cram pass on the following Tuesday. So, man, things are coming up pretty quickly. So thanks for joining us. And remember, follow Think 5 at a variety of places if you're interested in following them on social media and stuff like that, including, ooh, look, little birds, little cameras, little play buttons, an F, and a musical note, all kinds of places. Yeah, this boomer doesn't know what any of those stand for. So Twitter to Twitch to Facebook to Instagram to YouTube, all of those work fantastic. Good way to keep yourself notified if you don't get the emails. So what are we doing tonight? We're talking about the College Board announcement and just reviewing that real quick. And then we're diving into Unit 5 and Unit 6. There's question and answers throughout. Feel free to jump in with big questions down below, questions along the way on the side. Feel free to do that. All right, so let me make this screen a little bit bigger. You've seen enough of me for tonight, for the most part. So College Board announcement, remember, you have a modified DBQ. It's online. It's a modified DBQ that's only online in 45 minutes. It's at home. It's a whole bunch of stuff. 5 documents instead of 7. One's non-textual. Units 3 through 7. Hopefully you've all heard this already. If you haven't, check out some of the other streams that we've been doing. We've been covering that a bit more extensively, as well as the Five has a how to do the DBQ guide, all that kind of stuff. We got you covered. It is open note and open book, but don't copy, don't work with your friends, right? You don't want to get your scores invalidated for cheating. And it's on a 10-point rubric. The 10-point rubric looks fairly similar to what you have already seen and have already been working with in your AP classes, right? So it looks kind of like this. This is the AP rubric for this year. And it's going to involve thesis, contextualization, same thing as before, and then using and hipping the documents, also same as before, just more of them, and thus able to get more points to be able to separate people. So that way, using one question, right? So be aware of that. Be practicing those, looking for old questions, making sure that you're doing those practice questions that your teachers are sending out, or just doing it on your own. You can find all the practice previous year's ones on the College Board website. Sonia, I don't know for sure, and this is pure speculation, right? Because they always make the curve after they've graded all of the exams. It depends on how hard it is. So it's pure speculation. My guess is if we're talking percentages and previous year percentages hold up, probably an 8 to get a 5. But that's based on, extrapolation of data that's not really that valid. I don't know. But that would be my off the back of the napkin sort of math sort of guess. But I don't know. Yeah, can I qualify that enough? Can I say that I'm guessing? Did I mention that enough? We just don't know. And then, yeah, will the DBQ be in a to what extent format? It could be, yeah. That's typically what most of them have been, Monica. So good question. It wouldn't be multiple questions in the sense that it won't be more than one thing you have to answer. It's just going to be like a normal DBQ where it says, evaluate the differences between the antebellum reform movements and the postbellum reform movements or something like that, right? A lot of them tend to use that evaluate the extent to which language. It's not required to, but they're all going to be using the CCOT, compare, contrast, or causation. So in that sense, we know what's going on. All right, so that's the rubric, and hopefully you've spent some time familiarizing yourself with it. If not, that's a good thing to Google and get onto the College Board. Let's talk period 4 and 5. So remember, last time we were together for this review, last week, Thursday, we talked about periods 3 and 4. Period 4 now goes into period 5. In fact, there's even some overlap. So why is that? Well, remember, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in period 4 that you kind of need to know for period 5. That's going to be really, well, contextualization, maybe. It depends on the prompt, right? So antebellum reform movements are going on. One of the biggest ones of those is going to be abolitionism, when westward expansion is happening, but at the same time, there's the controversy over slavery in the territories. And so you're seeing this constant theme of slavery in the background. The market revolution, cotton is expanding, transportation is expanding, cotton mills up north, but also cotton plantations down south. Slavery is moving west. Notice how slavery is underneath all of this. The Industrial Revolution, political parties start to form in the second system with the Democrats and the Whigs, but then they fragment thanks to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We'll talk about that in a second. And there's sectional tensions. The North and the South tend to be a bit different during this time for a variety of reasons, the biggest of which is going to be, of course, slavery. Antebellum reform movements involving immigrants, right? So they're coming up north, and then there's some people that want to make them into Americans, some people that say, hey, you do you, that's fine, and the know-nothings, the nativist group that don't like them. But again, slavery backs up all of this stuff. They don't move down south because there's slavery down there. There's differences on the tariff because of slavery. There's differences on political capital and political power, and it's all about slavery. So that provides a really nice way to kind of segue period 4 into period 5. If you have a period 5 prompt and you're not talking about slavery, I don't know what class you took, right? Big deal. So that's period 4 kind of moving into period 5, and it's a great way to think about contextualization. Talk about what happened immediately before and why it's important. So that's kind of some contextualization practice for us. So Unit 5, what's the big overview of Unit 5? Well, remember, it goes from 1844 to 1877. This is my first question for you. Go ahead and answer in the chat if you think you have it. Why does it start in 1844? What's the big deal there? Peter's got it. It's the election of James K. Polk. Nice job. And then it goes until 1877. The next question for you, why 1877? Sonia, you got that one. Yeah, election of Rutherford B. Hayes, or as John Green likes to call him, Rutherford B. Hayes, and I enjoy that. So we'll talk about that a little bit. This is basically going to be, if you had to break it down into 3 sections, the road to the American Civil War, the Civil War, and the aftermath of the Civil War, right? 1844 is the election of Polk, so you get the Mexican-American War, you get Manifest Destiny, and then the election of Rutherford B. Hayes is the end of Reconstruction, a.k.a. after the Civil War. So that's kind of your basic overview in case you're wanting that. There are a lot of dates that we could go over when it comes to the American Civil War, right? And all of these have to do with slavery. So you can go all the way back to 1787 with the Constitutional Convention that has the 3/5 clause, and then it just keeps building. One of the things that I'm going to have my students do pretty soon, and that I would advise you to do too, is to be thinking about various statements you can make about causation or about CCOT or about how things are changing and continuing over time by looking at various parts of a timeline and then saying, okay, what's going on here? So when we look at all these events, oh, sorry, that's hidden by my face. It's the cotton gin. As we look at all these events that have to do with slavery, notice how this is definitely not to scale, and events start to accelerate in the 1850s. There's a lot of events happening in the 1850s, and by the time we get to Lincoln's election and secession, there's been a lot of bloodshed already. Think Bleeding Kansas. Think Charles Sumner getting beat with a cane by Preston Brooks, right? So a couple ways to think about this, and I mentioned this before, but you got to use historical thinking skills to be able to structure your review. And when you do so, you want to be thinking about statements you could make about this. So let's say antebellum compromises over slavery became shorter lived, or the arguments became bloodier, or the arguments became more polarized, or the arguments became increasingly heated. However you want to state that, you should be thinking about something like that, because it's certainly true in here. You can see it in the timeline. But you want to be thinking about direction and magnitude in your thesis statement. That's a good argument to be able to make. So some antebellum geography, a reminder about a couple of things, and let's see if I can get this to work here. So remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to be right here. That's modern-day Kansas. That's modern-day Nebraska. But the Missouri Compromise line is right here. And then initially, this is all Spanish territory until the United States takes it over thanks to the Mexican-American War. So we'll get into that a little bit. It's handy to know some of your states. You don't have to know all of them, but geography is pretty important. If you want a review of geography, we did a question and answer session a few weeks ago about geography that kind of outlines some of the things you need to know. It's a good idea. You don't have to know where exactly, say, Arizona is, but California, very important. Missouri, very important for this reason. Iowa, not so much, but sorry, Iowans, but very important. I'm from Michigan. It's the one that looks like a hand. It's really easy to point out, so that's not a problem at all. Hey, look, there's Michigan. So what happens with California and Texas, and why do you need to know those so much? We'll dive in a little bit more, but again, make sure that you know some of your geography. And then there's the Kansas-Nebraska territory, in case you forgot from the earlier map. I would also know some Civil War geography. As we go a little bit further down the line, you need to be aware of what states secede, what states stay loyal, what states have slaves but stay loyal. Those are the yellow ones, the border states, right? Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Slave states that stay in the Union, which is a bit unusual. The blue states are the United States, the ones that stay loyal, the ones that are Union. And then the rebels, the traitors are in red there. Lower South, darker red being the ones that secede before Lincoln even gets inaugurated, and then the upper South secedes after Fort Sumter. Yeah, I mean, you could consider Virginia a border state at first, I suppose, but they secede after Fort Sumter, and by the time the Civil War happens, the capital of the Confederacy is in there. So yeah, it depends on what time you're talking about. And Sonia, I was just about to say, thank you, West Virginia, aka this part. Oh, you can't see it because it's in red. This part of Virginia certainly would be considered a border state too, if you want. They become a thing in the middle of the Civil War because they secede from Virginia and stay in the Union. Go West Virginia. Nice job. Yep. So it's handy to know some of those as well as some of the tactics. So let's get into this a little bit. A brief overview of the Civil War. You need to know some of these things. The slavery is the context for the Civil War, remember. You need to be aware of some key victories here. And a lot of the things that led to the Civil War are going to be a lot earlier in period 4, but you could also talk about some other ones like in the 1850s. If we go past this a little bit, sorry, I want to go back, not forward. So let's talk about a few of these. So ones that are particularly important for our purposes here for Unit 5. Mexican-American War. Mexican-American War is very important because that's going to lead to increased land out west. It's going to lead to questions over slavery's expansion into the Mexican cession, particularly California, because this land all used to be Mexican, but then Texas secedes, remember the Alamo, all that stuff in the 1830s, and then California becomes part of the Mexican cession, and that's something that they want to be able to take. Now, question for you, why does California become a state so quickly? They thought they had time, balance it out, free state, slave state. Why does California become a state so quickly? Segev's got it. It's the gold rush and settlement with the gold rush. Yes, Sonia. So that's a bit of a problem because it means that California wants to be a state really quickly, but notice it's on both sides of the Missouri Compromise line, which wouldn't necessarily work with it. It's also relatively large, and we didn't have another one to balance out for a slave state and a free state and a slave state like we did with Texas and Maine, Missouri and Maine. It just doesn't work that well, and so they have to make some sort of compromise. Well, initially, there's proposed to be the Wilmot Proviso, right? Like no slavery anywhere. It doesn't pass, but it says no slavery anywhere in the Mexican cession, and that just gets everyone really mad. And then what do? Well, keep in mind, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican-American War in 1848, and then the gold's discovered the same year, but no one finds out about it or is able to travel there until 1849, thus the San Francisco 49ers. And then they have to decide what to do with it once it wants statehood. And Christine, you've got it. It's the Compromise of 1850. And so the Compromise of 1850, it involves some minor things involving like no slavery in D.C., no slave trade in D.C., popular sovereignty in the New Mexico territory and stuff like that. But the biggest things to know are California becomes a free state. In exchange for, what does the South get? A new and improved, waiting for someone to throw this into the chat, nice job, fugitive slave law. Absolutely. Now, remember, there was a fugitive slave law in the Constitution, but it was rarely enforced, or at least it wasn't enforced as much as the South would have liked, and therefore they put in a new, more robust one. And so California becomes a free state, and there's no other state to balance it. But then these northern states, are they even able to be free states anymore? They start to pass things like personal liberty laws, essentially saying, we will ignore this, we will not return slaves. And yeah, Christine, DC stops the slave trade and there's popular sovereignty in the Utah and New Mexico territories. Honestly, though, if you're studying all of APUSH for one question, I would probably forget about that. I mean, if you remembered it, awesome. But the two big must-know parts of the deal are California's a free state, fugitive slave law, because it's super controversial, especially the fugitive slave law. But yes, you're right. DC stops the slave trade. Utah and New Mexico have popular sovereignty, which is where Stephen Douglas gets that idea that'll later become part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this grand compromise, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun's last gasp, Daniel Webster, these three great American titans, the heirs to the founders, as H.W. Brands calls them, they finally hammer out this whole compromise, and it lasts for 4 years. The Missouri Compromise lasted for 30. This lasts for 4 years because the next thing we get is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act, remember, pushed by Stephen Douglas. He wants to build a railroad, and he wants to be able to make sure that they're states, and he wants to be able to appease people on both sides because he has political ambitions, and basically he's going to say, hey, let the people there decide. Problem is no one lives in Nebraska at first, and people that live in Kansas are coming from either Missouri, a.k.a. border ruffians, or coming from the north, and they're starting to fight each other. You get bleeding Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 is going to lead to all kinds of violence, kind of the pre-Civil War. Plus, it splits the second-party system and just destroys it. The Democrats start to split a little bit. The Whigs definitely split, and they cease to exist as a party. After 1854, the Whigs cease to exist, and who takes over for them? Because they're really mad about Kansas potentially being an extension of slavery above the Missouri Compromise line. Popular sovereignty is a way for Stephen Douglas to go, hey, let them vote. I don't want slavery, or maybe I do. I don't know, but let them vote. So what party is against the Kansas-Nebraska Act and thus becomes a party only because they don't like it? And Segev, Christine, yes, the Republican Party, yes. John C. Fremont is their first candidate for president. I just thought you were yelling at me. You were like, Republican! I knew that one. Yeah, they're going to become a party because they hate the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There's going to be some so-called conscience Whigs, a.k.a. Northern Whigs, whose consciences are bothered by slavery. There's going to be some know-nothings, some Liberty Party, free soil people. Oh, totally fine. You can shout at me in the chat as much as you need to with all caps. I mean, it's a big deal, right? This is a honking big deal. And all those people come together, Liberty, free soil, know-nothing, conscience Whigs, and they form the Republican Party. It only has support in the North. And remember, eventually in 1860, Lincoln is going to get elected without any Southern votes whatsoever. And so the North is going to get all kinds of power, mostly because that's where all the immigrants are going, right? They just have a higher population. Even with the 3/5 clause, the South can't cheat enough to be able to get more electoral power, at least not at first. So if we look at this, we've covered the Compromise of 1850. Uncle Tom's Cabin happens in there, right? Literature. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act happens. The Republican Party is born. Dred Scott v. Sanford, right? A guy sues for his freedom. He's an enslaved African-American. He sues for his freedom. The Supreme Court says no. And Supreme Court Roger B. Taney, he's the Chief Justice, and he says the black people have no rights the white race is bound to respect, and basically invalidates even the Compromise of 1850 and the Missouri Compromise. And he just says, look, slaves are property. You can bring them anywhere. We can't interfere with private property. And this makes people up north really mad. So again, things just continue to get worse and worse and worse. The fancy word is exacerbated, right? It just makes it worse. And then the Lincoln-Douglas debates happen in 1848. Just another example of people going, hey, wait a minute. There's a big event happening in Illinois. Who cares? Well, it's all about slavery. And they're having a debate that a lot of other people are having. And even though Lincoln loses, he gains a nationwide following and a lot of respect from people, although pretty much just up north, right? So by the time Lincoln is elected, the South wants to secede, and there's the whole ball game. So how are you feeling on westward expansion causing debates over slavery, antebellum stuff, the causes of the Civil War? The North begins to be more and more militant, right? Abolitionism. We get people like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, David Walker, but also people like John Brown, right, who are getting increasingly militant. And then you have people down south who are saying this peculiar institution is really actually a positive good, like John C. Calhoun kind of people, right? And they're going to insist that slavery is a positive good. It's good for everyone, including the enslaved people, which is, super messed up. It's paternalism. Exactly, Sonia. Whenever we talk about this, I always ask for a volunteer that I can pat on the head. And then I go over and I say, oh, you poor little person, you need us to take care of you. And I'm like, that's super insulting, right? That's paternalism, which comes from the Latin word for father, right? So it's pretending that white people are acting like fatherly figures, hashtag worst dads ever, to their slaves. And that's just really not cool. And so they're pretending that somehow black people are inferior. They need white people to help them in a way that a child needs a father, which is super messed up. But yeah, paternalism is a great way to describe that. Let me just pause right there since we can start talking about the Civil War now. Any questions about the causes of the Civil War, getting into the Civil War, the road to it? We covered that pretty extensively. A lot of it's in period 4. It overlaps a little bit. But okay, I think we're doing all right. Christine was saying paternalism is kind of true during the Reconstruction due to the discriminatory laws. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. You mean like they had to get taken care of because the laws discriminated against them too much? That kind of thing? Oh, yeah. Yeah, it wasn't like, ooh, Arlette, that's an interesting comparison. I like that. Is paternalism kind of like the white man's burden? Yeah, it's sort of like an earlier version. And now let me be very clear here. Paternalism is a general sense, right? It's a general word. So I could be also the word patronizing, right? So like if you're patronizing someone, you're kind of talking down to them. And paternalism would be the same thing. You can be condescending or talking down to someone in any circumstance, but paternalism before the Civil War is absolutely very similar to the white man's burden of, oh, Anglo-Saxon white people, we have to take care of all those poor brown people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Actually, if you're interested in this a little bit more, and Christine, I don't want to get into this too much just because I could talk all day about this because racial history is kind of my thing. But read the book Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. The subtitle is A Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Fascinating, really good, and it kind of delves into this a little bit because we need to be careful that we don't say, oh, racism wasn't a big deal and it doesn't exist, which is just ridiculous. But at the same time, we also don't want to be like, oh, those poor helpless blacks, they could never do anything without the white saviors or something like that too, right? Because you can kind of be paternalistic on either side. And so, yeah, African Americans were living in poverty after the Civil War, or at least many of them were. Partly thanks to discriminatory laws, but there's also plenty of very successful African-American communities, your Mound Bayous, your Tuskegee Institute kind of stuff, right? So there's always exceptions, and there's always African-Americans working really hard and white people trying to hold them down, but also some white people trying to help them up too, and people helping each other. So it's always more complicated, yeah. But Arlette, I love that comparison to white man's burden, imperialism. Yeah, U.S. like white supremacist stuff from Manifest Destiny all the way to imperialism. Yeah, it's all over there. So we talked about slavery as the context for the Civil War. Let's talk about some key victories. Remember, I would say there's maybe like 3 or 4 that you should know. You don't have to know all of those, but it's not a bad idea. The biggest thing here is that the North wins because of superior manpower and production, but also they managed to keep Europe out of it, right? So Antietam keeps Europe out the first time. Gettysburg keeps Europe out the second time. Vicksburg cuts off the Mississippi, so they have this Anaconda plan. They're going to squeeze the South from the outside and thus use their long-term superior manpower and production capabilities. Antietam also allows Lincoln to do what? What does Lincoln do? This is a question for you to put into the chat. The Antietam, he spins it as a victory for the North. Kind of a draw, but he spins it into a victory for the North, and it allows him to do what? That turns the tide of the war. Nice job, Christine and Megan. Yes, the Emancipation Proclamation. He says, look, we won, and now we're going to do this as a war measure. So remember, the Emancipation Proclamation is under Lincoln's authority as a wartime president. He's going to take away the property of the South because they're using their property to rebel. And thus, it not only takes away stuff, people but stuff they would think of it then, right? They would take away not only material from the South, but also add manpower to the North, because after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect January 1, 1863, African Americans can join the U.S. Army. There's also the Confiscation Acts. That would be other things to remind yourself about. Benjamin Butler's letter about contraband. What do you do? But either way, the whole point here is African Americans leave the South and then have to free themselves by running away to the North or by running away to Union lines. And then Mobile Bay and Atlanta both happened right before Lincoln's reelection. He was worried he wasn't going to get reelected, and he was running against a peace Democrat, George McClellan, the former general that he fired after he kind of stunk it up after Antietam, etc. And Lincoln was worried that the war might not finish all the way, and so he was able to win largely thanks to soldiers' votes after and the tide turning after Mobile Bay and Antietam, Atlanta, when people started to say, "Hey, maybe we can actually win this after all." So why does the United States win the Civil War against the rebels? Superior manpower, more manufacturing. Eventually they have really good leadership like Sherman and Grant, and they're going to be able to wear them down. A couple of key victories, which you might be able to know. Lincoln's rhetoric, Lincoln's leadership, that's a big deal too. And then also be aware that Europe stays out of this whole thing, even though the Confederates want to be able to have them join their side. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Remember, African Americans can join the Union or the North or the United States after the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln tries to make this all about American ideals, right? So we're going to see things like the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, and the new birth of freedom. This gives additional oomph to the Union cause. Yeah, the Civil War was caused by slavery, but it wasn't necessarily always fought for slavery per se. It was more like it was fought for preserving the Union, and slavery was tearing the Union apart. But then Lincoln starts to go, wait a minute, there's probably a higher calling here. Let's make this a war of liberation, not just a war of unification. And so you get contraband where slaves run away, but you also get the 54th Massachusetts, which are a very powerful, good example. If you've seen the movie Glory, you know what I'm talking about. A really powerful example of African Americans taking their liberation into their own hands, which is fantastic. And Lincoln's all about that. Okay. That's the Civil War in a nutshell. Much like with everything else in APUSH, we don't really care too much about the battles themselves, other than like why they happened and why they were important. But we're not going to get into military strategy and stuff like that. Then we have Reconstruction, aka the period after the Civil War. Although you could argue that it begins during the Civil War, and that's the how do we solve the problem that is the aftermath of the war with three big questions. What do we do with the rebels, the former Confederates? What happens with them? Do we hang them all? Do we imprison them all? Do they never get to vote again? What happens? What should we do with the freedmen, the former slaves? The formerly enslaved African Americans are now free, but remember, many of them are impoverished. They have nothing more than the clothes on their back, maybe a couple of tools. They're agricultural workers. You can't just say, all right, go on, have a good life, see ya, hope you're able to, make some money somehow. You could, but I feel like that'd be pretty heartless, right? They've been working for free for decades. What are we going to do with that? And then, of course, who gets to decide those two questions, the president or Congress? Because you're going to have a couple different presidents during this time period, Lincoln and Johnson, and then you have those two gentlemen in Congress that are going to be very important, and a thorn in the side of Mr. Johnson. Here we go. Charles Sumner, back from recovering after getting the cane beating, and Thaddeus Stevens. And those guys are going to be radical Republicans and very much opposed to Andrew Johnson, who takes over after Lincoln gets shot. Ulysses Grant is president during Reconstruction as well. You don't have to know a whole lot about him other than he's president when the KKK is put down, which is good for him. The 15th Amendment is passed during his tenure, and there's a lot of corruption too. So what else do we know about Reconstruction? Well, it changes the United States for a variety of reasons. If we go back to these guys, remember Lincoln has the 10% plan. Johnson has his lenient restoration where he just says, let's hug it out. The radical Republicans have at first they have a whole bunch of different proposals that involve punishing the South, right? And Lincoln's going to pocket veto some of those, and like the Wade Davis bill, for example, and they want to punish the South. And this is the crucial part, help the former slaves. So that seems pretty radical at the time, which I know nowadays we're like, yeah, but back then it was really radical. Because remember, they used to have slaves. They used to own people, right? The threshold for changing racism is a whole lot different. So they're going to argue and it's going to change the United States. First of all, federalism is going to shift. There's going to be a lot more emphasis on the central government, which happened during the Civil War anyway. There's going to be constitutional changes. What amendments do you need to know for Reconstruction? And do you remember how to remember those amendments very nicely? What amendment numbers do we need to know for Reconstruction? Go ahead and throw those in the chat. Christine's got it. It's 13, 14, 15. Thanks, Fady. A handy reminder to remember 13 through 19. If you start with 13, you say free citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. And that's a good way to remember. So free citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. I don't remember who came up with that. I certainly didn't, but I love it and I use it all the time. So the 13th Amendment frees the slaves. Oh, except for loopholes. The 14th Amendment gives equal citizenship to everybody and equal protection under the law. Oh, except for loopholes. The 15th Amendment gives voting rights to African-American males. Think especially veterans and ex-soldiers. Oh, except loopholes, right? So you should be aware of constitutional changes, but also loopholes, 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 loopholes. And if I can recommend and assign one documentary, it's the documentary 13th. Oh my goodness. Watch it. It's on Netflix. It's fantastic. It's mind-blowing, and it'll make you very, very angry, but also a lot more historically literate. Peter, I'm glad you started it. That first part is all about convict leasing and stuff like that. It's crazy, crazy stuff. It'll blow your mind, right? Another one, a little bit drier, but a deeper dive, is Slavery by Another Name. It's a PBS special, also a book by Douglas Blackman. But either way, things like black codes, convict leasing, the KKK, or sharecropping. The black codes are laws that only apply to black people. That's not equal citizenship. Convict leasing says we can arrest you for any reason and then make you work forever like a slave, because the loophole in the 13th Amendment is no slavery except for punishment of a crime. Hello. The KKK, the famous white supremacist group using violence. You can't vote or you can't be equal if you're fearing for your life all the time. Sharecropping, it's debt cycles. It's like debt slavery, right? So you start getting all of these things that undermine it. Eventually, after Reconstruction is done, or actually as Reconstruction is finishing and after it's done, you're going to get Supreme Court cases that undermine it as well. The most infamous happening, of course, later in 1896, and that's going to be the one that institutes and formalizes Jim Crow and makes it legal. Jim Crow laws, aka segregation. What's the Supreme Court case that makes segregation legal, legalizes Jim Crow? Nice job, Peter. It's Plessy v. Ferguson. Yeah. Plessy is going to be the culmination of a whole bunch of Supreme Court cases that all undermine the 14th Amendment. And they say separate, yeah, but also equal, except not really equal. So there you go. Remember, Andrew Johnson throws down with Congress, and so the Congress wants to pass the Freedmen's Bureau. They do under Lincoln. It's supposed to help out ex-slaves, right? Help them get married, get jobs, get food, get assistance, get housing. But it also applies to poor white people down south too. Like, this is a good thing. But Johnson wants to veto the extension of it, and so Congress starts to fight with him. Lincoln's 10% plan, well, it never gets off the ground because he dies. But then the Wade Davis bill gets vetoed. Johnson's lenient restoration. He starts to allow ex-Confederates to come back in. He doesn't really care. As long as you free the slaves, I don't really care about anything else. Don't give them any rights. Well, then you start to get black codes. Congress finds out and gets really pissed. And so eventually they're going to impeach Johnson over a variety of things. And Johnson, remember, is found not guilty. He's one of 3 presidents that have ever been impeached. Johnson, Clinton, and Trump, all 3 of whom were found not guilty. And he was, yes, Peter, saved by 1 vote. So after this, basically Congress is in charge and the radical Republicans take over. They start passing the Reconstruction Acts. They put troops down south. There's a variety of Reconstruction cartoons that we could look through here. But again, this would be Thomas Nast saying, look, we're pardoning former rebels. Shouldn't we give the right to vote to ex-soldiers, like African-American ex-soldiers who literally fought for their country? You're going to see things like Johnson fighting with Congress. You're going to see things like troops down south. Remember, the Reconstruction Acts are placed so that troops go down south, and that way ex-Confederates can't harm this poor freedman. But alas, the troops can't be everywhere. They're not in a lot of rural areas, and they're often free to roam around in non-city places. And so this cartoon is showing, is this guy really free to vote? No, of course not. He's being threatened with violence. This one shows the end of Reconstruction. We'll get to that a little bit later. But if you want to know more about this, look up the short answer question from a few years ago. This was a short answer question comparing Grant's administration, where he was allegedly sort of like getting hard on the South and like burdening them too much. And then Rutherford B. Hayes is like, let them do whatever they want. Let them alone policy. And then notice the prospering in the background, but also I'm pretty sure that's sharecropping right there. So, not always a silver lining. So all of these loopholes and Reconstruction's kind of failure leads to it being maybe worse than slavery, right? Because at least during slavery, slaves were able to have their life perhaps be protected by white people because they were considered an investment. Afterwards, they're not even considered an investment. And so wow, that's terrible. The White League is just another version of the KKK, like the White Citizens Council, et cetera. It's just another terrorist organization down south in charge of, well, not in charge, but that tries to keep black people from voting, et cetera. So the Reconstruction ends in 1876 when Tilden, as you can see right here, Tilden is facing off against Hayes. And Tilden is a Democrat, down south support. Hayes is a Republican, up north support. And the South threatens to secede if Tilden doesn't get elected because there's some contested votes in some states like Florida, because, it's always Florida. But it ends up being they become disarmed because they end up with this compromise, the Compromise of 1877, which says, hey, Hayes becomes president. In exchange, remove the troops from the South and we'll treat black people nicely. Like you see in this cartoon, except, yeah, who's going to trust that guy, right? He's got like an evil villain mustache, like he's going to tie a damsel to a railroad tie, and he's telling this black guy that he can certainly be trusted to be nice to him, but that's not the case. So let me just finish up one more thing with that, and that is this is the Compromise of 1877. You should know that. That's an important date, partly because it's the end of the period and partly because it represents the failure of Reconstruction. Is there a bunch of African-American suffrage during Reconstruction? Sure. Blanche K. Bruce, Hiram Revels, PBS Pinchback, fantastic names, right? You get a whole bunch of gentlemen who are elected to Congress, but remember some of the disappointments. First of all, ladies don't have the right to vote, right? The 15th Amendment only applies to black males. African-American females really didn't have the right to vote until 1968 or 1965. Like, that's crazy. That's crazy. Whereas, yeah, and yep, the National Association for Women's Suffrage starts to divide, right? Why didn't they, Teaguest? Because, remember, African Americans get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, but, that's only males. And then women get the vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. But here's the thing, even down south and a lot of places up north, there were still all kinds of voting fraud and discrimination and things like that. So it's not really until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that African Americans are fully able to vote, and thus black women are going to be allowed to vote at that point too. So technically, should they have been able to vote because of the 19th Amendment? Yes. In reality, did many of them, especially since a lot of them live down south? No, not as much. Northern black women, sure, but yeah, the Voting Rights Act of 65 is aimed at making sure that black people, both men and women, can vote, especially down south. Although that's been changing recently. Grr. Yeah, and Fady, you stole my transition. Fantastic. Yes. Notice what's happening in the background, right? There's some factories going on there. Kind of shows the new South. And so we'll see that the South quickly and the rest of the country quickly moves on. Like, hey, we've done enough for about, like, we got rid of slavery. What more do you want? You still hear people say this today, which is a little bit crazy. But like, we got rid of slavery. What more do you want? Let's move on. Let's make some money, right? We don't have time to deal with your feelings and racism and stuff. So after Reconstruction ends, we transition into period 6. Let me pause right there. Any questions on period 5, on Reconstruction, Civil War, road to the Civil War? We've paused for questions before. I think we're doing okay. If you have questions, you can always put them into the chat there. Otherwise, just for sake of time, let's go on to Unit 6. So Unit 6 is going to involve some overlapping dates. 1865 is the end of the Civil War, but also the start of the Industrial Age, or the Gilded Age, if any of you want to think. And it goes until 1898, which also overlaps with period 7. 1898 is the Spanish-American War, but it's also an important, well, it's 2 years after the election of McKinley, and it's just a handy-dandy marker, I suppose, mostly because of the Spanish-American War. So what are the big 3 here? You need to be aware of the American West. So this is the Homestead Act, etc., the rise of industrial capitalism, and immigration, migration, and culture, which is kind of vague, but we'll talk about that. So notice the Saudi house there, and then the steel mill picture as well. You need to be aware of that. By the way, just kind of as an overview, when you're looking at APUSH review and you're like, oh my goodness, there's so much stuff. How can I remember all of this? Oh my goodness. Start big, work your way down to the details. If you see something happening during the Industrial Revolution or something happening during these time periods, think, yes, as Tegas is saying, industrial growth from the Civil War, absolutely. All the manufacturing that happens, it sparks a big boom. War is unfortunately good for business sometimes, as long as you're winning. And my goodness, it was a good war for a lot of inventors, a lot of people making money, and industrialization coming out of the war. Yes, absolutely. So let's dive into that a little bit. So immigration and migration during period 6. You need to be able to explain like why people moved west and what are the immigration push and pull factors that are involved. So this is the picture of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's both a push and a pull factor, right? So that's going to be created by Republicans in Congress during the Civil War, actually, but it's completed in 1869. It's going to allow for faster transportation all over. The Homestead Act is going to pull people out west with the promise of free land. But of course, free land involves taking it from the Native Americans, so that's going to be a problem. The Morrill Land Grant Act gives land to states for colleges and things like that. People move out west for mining, for timber. And then, of course, there's various inventions that enable this to happen, like the McCormick Reaper ends up making farms a whole lot more efficient. Barbed wire enables ranching to be more efficient. You can know a couple of those, right? If you've seen the America, the Story of Us Heartland episode, you know all of this, right? There's a lot of stuff in there. And it's a good one to watch. I believe that whole thing's on YouTube, too. If somebody wants to find the episode, they can throw it in the chat if they want. America, the Story of Us Heartland is the name of that. The Grange movement starts to be a thing, right? So you should be aware of farmers and people out west starting to protest against the railroads, taking advantage of them, starting to be able to cooperate a bit more, partly for loneliness reasons, partly for economic reasons. The Farmers Alliance, that eventually is going to lead to the People's Party and the Populist Party. So parties like that are going to rebel, that are going to be sort of against the big business of railroads. They're almost like the progressives, except they're going to be out west and down south, wherever there's a lot of rural areas with a lot of farming. And of course, their big issue is silver. So that'll be a big deal too. Bimetallism, right? They want inflation because it helps them out because they're debtors and they want to be able to have inflation. If you owe $100 and suddenly inflation goes way up and $100 isn't worth that much, you're like, cool, I can pay that back, no problem, right? Then just general immigration. Unfortunately, you have this super racist cartoon here about Uncle Sam kicking out this person. This is referring to what particular immigration group that you need to be aware of from the 1880s, who unfortunately get discriminated against a whole bunch. Yeah, nice job. This is the Chinese and the Chinese Exclusion Act. So who are the so-called new immigrants? I mean, old immigrants, Germans, Irish, English, Dutch, etc. The new ones are from Southern and Eastern Europe. Think Greeks, think Italians, and also Chinese from Japan. Russians, yep, Jews, Polish people, all that kind of stuff, and plenty of people from Mexico. But unfortunately, as is almost always the case in American history, good thing we've learned our mistake in 2020, right? When there's a lot of immigration, we tend to think, oh no, immigrants are scary because they have new ideas and they're taking our jobs and yada, yada, yada. And so there's a whole bunch of xenophobia, a whole bunch of nativism, a whole bunch of racism. And the Know Nothing Party, although, Peter, it is gone, right? You're just referencing the fact that it's similar. Yeah, Know Nothing Party is before the Civil War, but this is going to happen afterwards too. Even though it's not a party, we're going to have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the questions about assimilation, right? Like, can we make these people into real American citizens? Should we allow them to live in their ethnic enclaves? I mean, my goodness, I live in a place called Holland, Michigan. You'll never guess what kind of people live here. A lot of Dutch people. Everybody does this, right? And absolutely, Hull House, Jane Addams's Hull House is going to be one of the factors in this assimilation movement. And political machines. A lot of these new immigrants are going to move into urban centers. They need assistance. And so urban political machines are going to help them out, but also, like Boss Tweed, sometimes be rather corrupt in exchange for the helping out the immigrants and votes and things like that. Be aware that there's also going to be a lot of change with women and children moving into the workforce thanks to industrialization. That involves a bit of a movement. We're going to see increased urbanization because of that and just increased changes about where people are living and how they're living. So speaking of industrialization, let's talk about that, the rise of industrial capitalism. First of all, Can anyone identify those two pictures there? Either the gentleman or the invention that is up above. The two are not connected, other than they both exist at the same time. Yeah, Sonia, you got it. That's the Bessemer process up ahead. And then Tegist, you're trying to type Rockefeller. I got you. Yeah, that's Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller, the richest American, possibly richest person of all time. We don't really know, probably Mansa Musa, but yeah, that's him. So you need to be able to explain the effects of technology, social changes from the tech, economic changes from tech, and the government responses to industrialization. That's a big deal too. And yeah, Rockefeller is rocking a mighty mustache, I tell you. So what are some of the effects of technology? Well, first of all, we get power changes, right? So water to steam, wood to kerosene. We start to use oil a whole bunch, moving from horses to engines, not only steam powered like water wheels and things, but we're talking full on big, heavy industry. Christine, yeah, Carnegie is pretty rich, but Rockefeller is richer. Rockefeller is the richest American of all time. Some estimates put his wealth between 150 and 400 billion dollars. Carnegie was worth maybe only 80 to 120 or so billion dollars, which is still more than Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, but that's a big deal. Carnegie sold his company for a lot of money, but yeah, I know. Sorry, Sonia. The only was supposed to be super sarcastic. I mean, these guys were so loaded. Most of the richest Americans in history, when adjusted for inflation, happened during the Gilded Age, right? Why is it called the Gilded Age, by the way? Because gilded means covered with a thin layer of gold. And so it looks really good on the outside, but on the inside, it's not that great. And Sonia, you're right. Mark Twain. I think I've told this story before. Last time I was teaching about this one. But in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, there's a level where you go into a bookstore and you have to save Paris from a gas attack. And in the bookstore, I was like, I'm playing this, but I want to figure out what books they have in this fictional bookstore. And turns out they had a whole bunch of copies of Mark Twain's The Gilded Age, which was hilarious and awesome and a huge nerdy, geeky moment for me. Mark Twain's Gilded Age is all about how it looks good from the outside, but on the inside, it's full of corruption, racism, danger, et cetera, et cetera. So these guys get really, really rich on the backs of their workers. Cough, cough, Amazon during the coronavirus. All right. Please, Mr. Bezos, don't cut us off. New inventions and innovations that happen. A whole bunch of those. Bessemer process, we already mentioned, that leads to urbanization, more steel production, vertical and horizontal immigration, right? You can even have innovations in business structure. So we get the first corporations and railroads, but we also get vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical integration, meaning you own one step of all parts of the process. So Carnegie Steel would be that, for example. Horizontal, you own all of one step. Refineries with Standard Oil will be an example, although eventually he just owns everything with a monopoly. Be aware of things like middle management and corporations. So you get managerial positions, you get the managementization, or however you want to say that, just where it's no longer a boss and working with some apprentices or a boss working with people. It's the owner is out there, who knows, and then we have managers who come in and manage the workers. Be aware of things like monopolies, trusts, Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel, JP Morgan's banking, et cetera. Those are all good things to be aware of. Singer sewing machines, and then a consumer culture, right? Where everyone's like, hey, I want to buy stuff. There's the mail order catalog. Sears and Roebuck sell through the mail, and the Singer sewing machine is going to allow ready to wear clothing. So you don't make your own clothing at home anymore. You just buy it from people and they make it for cheap. Problem is, of course, there's going to be a downside, and that's where we get into these socioeconomic changes, right? We're going to see women and children in the workforce, which might be good for some of them, but child labor is generally frowned upon nowadays. And women getting to work is awesome as long as they want to. And the problem is a lot of times they don't necessarily have a choice. Standard of living does go up during the Gilded Age, partly because the prices of everything starts going down because they're made more efficiently. But man, what a cost sometimes. And then, Sonia, you were asking, doesn't religion shame wealth less as social Darwinism becomes more accepted? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, especially Christianity, the main religion in America at that point, is going to have a very ambivalent, like kind of feeling about wealth. On the one hand, you are going to have some people that say, hey, you earned it. God blesses those who work hard, and, the Protestant work ethic and all that stuff. But also at the same token, you can have people like the social gospel, exactly, Tegist, who say, I'm going to go into the slums with the Bible in one hand and a piece of bread in the other, and thus help people out. And just don't just say, hey, you're saved and going to heaven. Okay, enjoy the rest of your crappy life. But like, no, we need to help people in the here and now. And yeah, social Darwinism, oof, that's a brutal doctrine, right? Survival of the fittest, but applied to people? Are you kidding me? Like, that's like, if you're poor, it's because you're dumb, stupid, and lazy, and I shouldn't help you because you're a waste of space and a waste of my time. And so work hard like me. Wow. Super excuse. Yeah, absolutely. And it assumes there's equal opportunity. Exactly, Sonia. Yep. One of my fancy phrases that I don't know if I coined this, but I like to think that I have, is that a lot of people don't realize the United States never was and still isn't a hyper-individualistic meritocracy, where like whatever I do, meritocracy, like you succeed based on your merits, how hard you work, how good you are, how smart you are, and then hyper-individualistic, where it's only about me and nothing else matters, right? You need to take into consideration society and the big structures, but seeing structures is so hard for so many Americans. So Sonia, I'm glad that you see that. Absolutely. Doesn't excuse not working hard, though, of course. And then there's the whole like robber barons or captains of industry, right? Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, you should know all those ones. Absolutely. Taylorism. And Segev, as much as you're joking about socialism in the chat, this is why socialism is so prevalent during this time period and so appealing to so many people. They're like, capitalism gets me nothing. I'm super poor. I'm dying. I'm literally dying in these factories. How about something better where the government takes over some stuff? And the government does take over some stuff. Right? I mean, you're going to see eventually more and more of that with the regulation. We've always had the post office, right? But yeah, Gospel of Wealth could be a document from period 6. I agree. And then this cartoon could be, right, the bosses of the Senate showing that like rich people control everything. And then Fady, getting there. Sorry, I just got distracted by the socialism comment. Taylorism is the idea of like scientific management. So like we're going to time you, make sure you're efficient and things like that. The ideas come about during period 6, although the height of Taylorism is actually going to be the 1910s with like Ford and his moving assembly line and stuff like that. You're going to see trusts and monopolies again. That's a big deal. And then the railroad strike, Homestead strike, Pullman strike, Knights of Labor, American Federation of Labor. You need to know about unions. Oh my goodness, please know about unions. And you need to know about unions fighting back. You need to know, pick a couple of your favorite strikes, whichever ones you want. But you need to know that one of the effects of industrial capitalism is that the workers try to fight back, and a lot of that involves unionization. Well, what's the government response to all this? Is it laissez-faire? Well, first of all, what does laissez-faire mean? It means hands-off. Is it truly hands-off? The government usually takes the side of the big business. And so there's kind of this myth. Exactly, Sonia. Sonia, you're like tracking with me. Nice job. Yeah, the government sides with big business. They typically are going to set, the picture right here is them sending in the National Guard, aka the local militia, to break up a strike. So you're going to see troops coming in to break up strikes. You're going to see the Sherman Antitrust Act that's supposed to go against monopolies actually being used against unions because they are interfering with interstate trade, which is crazy. And then you're going to see things like imperial ventures. Eventually the government's going to be like, hey, we need a safety valve. Let's get some places overseas so we can sell our industrial goods and thus help out the economy. And Christine, you are right. This is the time when the government was dominated by the Republicans. There's a couple of Democrats in there too. But yeah, for the most part, Republicans. Gilded Age politics involves a lot of like trying to clean up corruption and stuff. There's not a whole lot of difference between the parties at first. Republicans tend to be the party of big business like they are today, right? So then there's a whole bunch of debates that go on here too. Yeah, Grover Cleveland, for example. Yeah, Republicans equal business. It's a rule of thumb. Nice job. Yep. The Democratic Party is very corrupt. They're the ones that have like political machines, but the Republicans do too. And they're just in the pocket of big business. So there's different kinds of corruption, right? There's like immigrant political machines for the Democrats, scuzzy corporate lobbyists for the Republicans, right? Like, yep. But Boss Tweed is Democratic and in New York. So you should be able to explain things like the New South, increased economic opportunities, and reform movements as well. So let's go over those, and we'll wrap ourselves up along with talking a little bit more about politics too. Remember, the New South is the South going, hey, we didn't have any manufacturing or railroads during the Civil War. That made us kind of suck there. We should change this. And so you're going to see Henry Grady give his famous New South speech. He's going to talk about how they need to have industrialization down south. See the children working in coal mines. Birmingham becomes a steel center, Birmingham, Alabama. You're going to see all kinds. Oh, man. Again, that slavery by another name, almost all of the New South's industrialization was fueled by the big names that were all fueled by African-American labor thanks to convict leasing. By the way, convict leasing, aka you broke a law that I made up and now you have to work for this company forever like a slave, that didn't end until Truman's administration in 1945. What? That's crazy. Slavery by another name lasts until the time period when I know people that were alive. That's just absolutely mind-blowing. But at the same time, despite industrialization, they also want to still have King Cotton. It's still a big deal, right? And there's segregation all over the place, so we're not going to change that. So industrialize, but basically keep things the way they were before the Civil War in terms of racial hierarchies, think Plessy v. Ferguson, and convict leasing. Is there still cotton being grown in the South today? Absolutely, yes. In fact, I just went down south in October of this past year and took a bunch of pictures in a cotton field that looks very much like that. Yeah, a lot of cotton still down there. Depends on where you are. Oh, Sonia, you're from the South. Fantastic. Yeah, a lot of cotton around there, different places. There is some increased economic opportunity, right? There's a middle class that starts to form thanks to the managers and things like that. There's managerial workers. The Tuskegee Institute with this man, Booker T. Washington. There's a consumer culture. Think camping, think libraries, think the circus, all these opportunities where sometimes people have some, I think it's called leisure time. Am I saying that correctly? Right? Like people have time off sometimes if they are in the middle class. The problem is a lot of this leisure time and increased opportunity is built on the backs of the lower class and the working class, right? You are going to see some reform movements, and this is where we sort of start to overlap a little bit with period 7. Think the progressives, right? Yes, this is my lady. Ida B. Wells Barnett is a boss. Oh my goodness, she's the best. So you start to see some muckrakers. You're thinking like Thomas Nast, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells Barnett fights against lynching down south. She is a boss. Thomas Nast fights against Boss Tweed and corruption. You're going to see the social gospel again, trying to address people's physical needs in addition to their spiritual needs. And Tegas, what do you mean by here? Like during this time period or in this location? Because yeah, okay, yeah, Jim Crow starts to happen after Reconstruction ends, after 1877. And I would say it begins to become like a codified rule-based law thing in the 1890s. Yep. Yeah, Christine, I'd say muckrakers are like whistleblowers, but they're typically journalists. So they're going to be writing newspapers, articles saying, hey, look, I found some corruption. Do something about this, please. Social gospel again, like Walter Rauschenbusch. And then people like the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Excuse me. They're going to be fighting against alcohol, trying to advocate for temperance and then eventually prohibition. You're going to get people advocating for women's rights. You're going to get, like we mentioned before, Hull House attempting to help immigrants, but sometimes being a little bit pushy in that regard. And then, of course, political machines, Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed, fighting off against Thomas Nast. We talked about political parties a little bit before, but remember things like the Populist Party, a.k.a. farmers out west and down south. They want silver. They want government control of railroads. They want a lot more democracy. You're going to get Republicans versus Democrats on things like the tariff, still the Civil War legacy, waving the bloody shirt. Hey, don't vote for the Democrats. They were the party of secession. Democrats are like, yeah, but that was a long time ago, and that's not us anymore. And then like going back and forth. And then, of course, the currency wars, be aware of the gold or gold and silver, bimetallism, all that kind of stuff. And then things like the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. This is a very important law that I just read today that someone was saying that they didn't like this and they thought it was unconstitutional. I'm like, okay, interesting. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, I know, right? Garfield gets shot because the guy's like, you should give me a job, bang. And after that, everyone goes, wow, the spoils system is super messed up. How about we institute a thing where we hire people because they're qualified, not because they're cronies and they do what the person wants who's in charge, right? Instead of hiring your friends, how about we hire people that are qualified? Good thing that's not an issue anymore. Yeah. So the People's Party is the same thing as the Populist Party, Fady, and they're the ones that want like government control of railroads. They want free coinage of silver to increase inflation. Because remember, if you're a farmer and you're in debt, that's bad. And then, yeah, Sonia, you could make the argument that the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act discriminates against poor people who are less educated. Yes, you absolutely could make that argument. But you could also make the argument of, well, you might need to be educated for this job, so it depends. They do want direct election of senators, some of those things that will come about as a result of progressives later in period 7. Be aware of some of these cartoons. We're out of time, so we're going to wrap things up, but be aware you might see cartoons during period 6. There's a lot of them. Reconstruction cartoons during period 5, industrialization cartoons during period 6, like Standard Oil strangling government. This one, where like the rich fat cats are isolated from hard times by the workers who are really propping up the economy, right? Ones like that. This one, this famous one of Boss Tweed by Thomas Nast, the brains, but also he's motivated by money, Tammany Hall. And then you start to get things like this, the skyscrapers, urbanization, Singer sewing machines might be used in here. Maybe they're using Bessemer steel, etc. A lot of pictures and a lot of cartoons that you could potentially see. Okay, so questions that you have on periods 5 and 6 that I could help to answer. Anna, the link to these slides should be available on Fiveable with the replay as soon as we're done with this. Well, actually, that's not true. Once I'm able to upload it, it might take me a little bit of time depending on how fast my internet is. But yeah, you should be able to see all the slides very soon, certainly by tomorrow morning. Any period 5 or 6 questions? Shirtwaist fire at the same time or later? A little bit later. That's going to be in the 1910s. So, yeah. But that's one of the arguments actually that I make for why the Gilded Age should go all the way until, say, World War I. Because, yeah, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is a huge reason, a huge example of how the Gilded Age was super dangerous and how a lot of unions would fight for the big 3, right? Higher pay, fewer hours, better working conditions. Yep, down below, just click the resources thing. That's where the slides are. Peter, are they there? Are they there already? Because that would be awesome if they're there already. Sweet. Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, folks. Remember, we have some more coming up. Get that cram pass. Join us on Tuesday. Like to see you again. Thanks for joining us. Hope you're staying safe. You're staying sane. Good luck as you start studying for for APUSH. And we here at Fiveable will be with you the whole time. Have a good night. See you next time.